I talk to a lot of people really everywhere, and a lot of people just really think that our streams have always been like they are right now. They don't know. They think they've always had rainbows and brook trouts and brown trout in them, but that is not the case. I want you to remember this picture right here, because that picture of that fish is not what you think it is. You think it's a brown trout, it is a brown trout. But we'll talk more about that and what they've done with all the stocking and all that. But you know, how did these fish get here and what caused them to redo everything? This is a picture from, I think, circa 1890 to 1910, somewhere around there. And this is Looking Glass Creek. If you know where that is, that's right by the Davidson. Okay. That stream was loaded with brook trout at the time of this picture. Loaded. And I even did more research than the average fish was 20 to 22 inches. Okay. When you fish that, and I fished that stream a bunch, there are no brook trout in it. But that picture is from that era. And just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about, that's Looking Glass Falls right there. Same era. Looks the same. This is Bradley Creek right here. And that's a tributary of the North Fork of the Mills, which is DH now. Okay. Also rich in brook trout. Then, not now. Okay. So here's the culprit right here. Logging. So at the turn of the century, this is circa 1930. This is at Smokemont. We had these huge forests of balsam and chestnut, poplar. Greed took over. They came in, they set up all these, and almost all of these were in Pisgah, what is Pisgah now today, which, as most of you know, George Vanderbilt owned everything that's Pisgah. This was a huge sawmill. So what they would do, when they decided they were going to log a certain area, they would come in and they cut everything down. Okay? They cut everything down, cut them up in the sections that they needed to cut up. I don't know how many feet, that would be 15, 20 feet, and they just throw them into the stream. And some of these were very small streams. They would just load the streams up with them as they went up, and they were clear cutting everything, and they would just dump all these sections into the stream. And then they built splash dams, 22 feet high, and you see the opening of the gate. It's open there. So they would dump all this timber into the stream. They built a dam that they're letting the water go through there. But once they've got that stream bed loaded up, they put timbers in that gap, and then the water backs up in that behind that splash dam. Okay, no water from anywhere forward, but water behind the splash dam. And then when they're ready to float all that timber down to the French Broad or Little Tennessee or wherever, they just open up that splash dam, and you can imagine what happens. It sends everything, I mean, it scours. I mean, we're talking about 22 feet of water dammed up, and then all of a sudden you open up the chute and you let everything out. It's taking all the fish, it scours all the bug life, it scours the entire, I mean, everything. Not to mention there's nothing left to shade the stream. So one thing that trout have to have is cool, clean water, but you've taken away the shade factor. So now you have no shade, heats up the water. That would kill trout in itself. So they build these firewood chutes all up along the edge of the streams, and anything they weren't going to use for actual timber, they would just throw in the chutes, and they designed the chutes so that the refuse timber would just, you know, funnel down the chute. They were cutting everything down, and anything that they couldn't market for sale was used for fuel. And that's a picture of a steam saw. That's all they had back then. They were using everything. They were using the refuse wood to power the saw, and then everything else they were splashing out the streams and the rivers, you know, to take them on down to the big mills at Smokemont. There was a big mill down at the end of the East Tennessee and then off the French Broad. So there were other things that hurt our trout population almost as bad. The chestnut blight of, I think it was 29. We don't have chestnuts anymore, in case you guys haven't noticed. There are no more. They were wiped out. Chestnuts were one of the largest shade producers that we had in the Great Smoky Mountains as well as Pisgah. They were so prevalent. There were homes built out of chestnut. They were building homes out of chestnut at the time. All of our streams were wiped out. Streams like, the Davidson. I don't know if you've ever been up to the upper stretches of the Davidson way up above the hatchery. That was all brook trout. Hazel Creek was all brook trout. I mean, everything was brook trout. Everything. We didn't have rainbows and browns here. It was all brook trout. Native, that's why they call them native brook trout. They were all wiped out. The only streams that weren't wiped out were only a few streams that were way up in headwaters. I mean, one of the only streams that still has southern Appalachian strain brook trout in it is the upper stretches of Big Snowbird. And it's so far out, we're talking about 7-8 miles up. I was under the impression that, until I talked to some wildlife resource officers, that, a lot of these native brook trout, I mean, even where you think was a backcountry area, they logged it. They logged everything. Most of the small streams that I fish now, a lot of them aren't even brook trout anymore. But they reintroduced, in 31, the stocking program in the park. That's really where they started in North Carolina and Tennessee. Restocking all these streams that had been formerly brook trout, and they weren't restocking them with brook trout. That's why we have, and let me tell you, they were putting so much different stuff in our streams back then. I've talked to all kinds of these wildlife biologists and stuff that were privy to all what we were stocking. Rainbows, brooks, and browns, and the brooks are northern strain brook trout in most of our wild streams. They were restocked. There's only a few that were southern strain. Now, there's no difference in the two other than a genetic match. You'd have to do a DNA test. So that's not a big deal. But there are streams where we put Kamloops, rainbows. They were stocking all kinds of stuff. And I mean, if you talk to somebody out in Montana right now, they are really ticked off because they're stocking brook trout out there in their streams, and they don't like it. I mean, the guides out there will tell you, throw them on the bank. The balsam woolly adelgid. We don't have a lot of balsams anymore either, and that was another shade provider. Shade is very important, and I have this dispute with a lot of guys who think that, we get rid of the trees, we'll have more mayflies. Well, yeah, but you'll have less fish. You will have less. You'll have fewer fish because the water temperatures on a lot of the streams that we fish that are wild. I'm not talking about DH. I'm talking about wild streams. They cannot tolerate higher water temperatures. It gets hot enough in the summer as it is, but pretty much wiped out the balsams. This is a bigger culprit than you think. Wild boar, especially in the Smokies. Around 1920, there was a game preserve in Graham County up there around the Nantahala, and a bunch of wild boar escaped. And here's the problem with them. If you've ever been up in the Smokies and fished some of the small streams back there, it looks like a bulldozer has been through there. One or two of them will plow up an area, and you literally think you put a disc on a tractor and drove through there. They're looking for, roots and nuts and things like that. They defecate in the streams, and then everything they plow up runs off into the stream. So much that they've been trying to kill them and trap them up in the Smokies for years. They've got them down to a more manageable level, but that's never going to be satisfactory enough because they can have 8 to 10 in a litter a year. And they can start producing a litter at 6 months old. Yeah. When we fish up in the Smokies a lot, and we're up there, we see evidence of them every stream we fish up there. But they are a huge pest. They really are, much bigger than people realize. brook trout restoration started in '77, where there were streams that they had stocked with like rainbows or browns. 20 Mile Creek is a good example of this, where they went in and they told everybody, you can go up there and catch and keep anything you want because we're going to come in and we're going to poison the creek. Well, they go up there a lot of times. Back in '77, they were shocking everything to take them out. They'd go along, shock all the fish. They were literally throwing them up on the bank. They'd clean the entire stream out, and then they want to come back and restore it to complete. And there are a lot of streams, I understand, that were like this. A lot of where we have native brook trout now, and some of these are in the back country, like 3 or 4 miles back, where they've done this. If you haven't noticed, the entire focus of a lot of states is to return everything back to what it used to be. They've reintroduced the red wolf. They've reintroduced the river otter, which I am not a fan of. But they want to reintroduce a lot of these streams that could support. Brook trout have much higher standards for what they can tolerate than rainbows and browns. They need much cleaner water. They need much colder water. So that's why when you hear somebody talking about a wild brook trout stream, it's usually a little bit more farther out of the way. It's usually a smaller stream with a lot of shade at typically higher elevations. Back in the 1800s and earlier, they didn't need quite as much of an elevation difference because there was so much more forest and canopy over these streams. And that takes 10 degrees off.
Wow.
Okay. It's noticeable. If you go up and fish, I'm not divulging any secret here, but like Yellowstone prong up at Graveyard Fields off the Parkway. Anybody fish that? Okay, forget about it. Forget about it. But it's right off the road, and it's not a tiny stream. It's pretty much, for the most part, full sun, but it's at 5,000 feet above sea level. There aren't a lot of streams at 5,000 feet above sea level this size. It's a gem. I shouldn't have told you that. Our biggest culprit is this I want to talk about. It's the hemlock woolly adelgid. Now, hemlocks are probably right now, they're dying now. They're all dying right now. But of all the streams that I fish, this is the #1 shade provider. They're huge trees. They're old. And they're all dying. Some of my favorite streams, we can't even fish anymore because they're literally trees laying across the entire stream the whole way up. We're afraid we're going to get hit by a falling tree. I'm not kidding. They're falling like that. They tried to spray them. That didn't work. Biltmore is actually having some success on their private grounds with controlling them. Okay? Every time we have a problem, we say, okay, we've got something that'll solve the problem. It's another bug. And then that bug ends up being a worse problem. How do you think we got them? Same way. Control some other bug. But they're literally all going to be dead. They're all dying. I mean, we see it. And these are big trees. They're big trees. And they're really tall, so they provide a ton of shade. But this is probably our biggest threat right now is the hemlock woolly adelgid.